All right. What's going on, everybody? And welcome to the 2020-2021 Criminal Justice Reform Topic Lecture. Welcome also to the Detroit Urban Debate League Summer Camp. Obviously, it's through virtual means, unfortunately, because of the current pandemic. But hopefully, this will be like insightful enough for you to still be excited about the activity and still want to engage just as much, considering it's a very interesting topic, extremely relevant, and something that I think everybody will be able to get something out of. Just a little bit of brief context and information about myself. My name is Darcell Brown. I'm a senior at Wayne State University, pursuing a bachelor's in communication studies. I'm also an active member of the policy debate team. I also coach in the Detroit Urban Debate League for University High School Academy. I've been the coach for the past 3 or 4 years. So yeah, that's just like a little bit about me pretty much. Obviously, I'm a former alum of the league as well. So yeah, we pretty much can get into it. So this year, obviously, the resolution is that the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States in one or more of the following, be it forensic science, policing, or sentencing, right? So pretty much you have to enact some piece of legislation or some policy by the federal government in order to resolve some ills that are in these particular areas that are isolated. I will say that this is a pretty historic topic for a couple of reasons. One, be it that this is the first topic I think that was actually chosen by the topic committee, or at least by the community, which was written by Colton Gilbert, who is the head coach of Little Rock Central in Little Rock, Arkansas. So shout out to him. And just like I kind of previously mentioned, this topic itself is just very timely and relevant with all the social unrest because of police injustice and just a long history of the criminal justice system not being adequate in order to resolve some of the ills that are in our communities. So I think that it's super significant that we actually get to talk about a topic like this and get to talk about significant impacts that are relative to our community, especially somewhere like Detroit, and not have to worry about the question of the resolution or topicality or different things like that. Like, you actually are mandated to kind of talk about very serious discussions of racial injustice in our community. So I think that it's a super, super good topic. And like I said, I think it's extremely relevant, obviously, because of the individuals who just this past year alone have been murdered by the police or by racist individuals, but also because the United States just has a very unique issue when it comes to the question of criminal justice in terms of incarceration being extremely high in the United States, or at least in the world. We are only 5% of the population, but 25% of the world's prison population is housed in the United States, right? We spend billions of years annually in terms of housing individuals, paying for prisons in terms of upkeep, incarceration, court costs, etc. So a lot of money that obviously can go to a lot of different things. And then, yeah, just in general, the US itself is a system that really prioritizes, or at least only pays attention to the way in which we should respond in terms of a more kind of penal kind of aspect, right? Where it's you are not allotted any access to be rehabilitated because of the title of criminal that is placed on you once you are convicted of a certain crime, which makes society looks at you a different way, but also makes it to where legally there are certain rights that are taken away from you depending on what the crime is and the extent of whatever the law pretty much wants to do, right? Or judges or etc. Right? So yeah, like I said, I think it's a super important topic, and I'm kind of glad that we really get to talk about a lot of these very significant things. So I'm going to go down, I guess, in order of talking about the 3 topic areas, and then I'll kind of talk about affirmatives that I think are relevant to those areas as well. And then I'll go more into the T or the next stuff a little bit later on in the lecture. But first, I wanted to specifically isolate policing particularly. So the definition that I pretty much got when I looked it up is that policing is to regulate, control, or keep an order by means of a police or similar force, right? So essentially, obviously, I think it's pretty, common sense that policing has to do with some type of legal apparatus that is able to contain, control, and kind of surveil the community to make sure that they can follow up to see if crimes are being committed, to make sure that people are safe, all those type of things. So obviously the first thing that probably comes to mind when you think of policing is police themselves. So like cops, this is like local state police. We may think of like federal entities like the ATF or the Federal Bureau of Investigation, things like that. Military forces, right, are also relevant in the context of the topic as well, right? I also think of like surveillance as a way of policing, right? Just having cameras in a certain area, being able to kind of have that non-physical presence in the sense of like a body being there, but still having the ability to have access to like sight and things that are happening. Perfect example in Detroit, we have like the Green Light Project here, where a lot of stores, restaurants, and business fronts kind of have some type of interaction with like local police forces to where they actually have cameras that are set up that are directly, I guess, controlled by local police, right? To be able to see what is actively going on like busy streets and different corners, different stores, and things like that, right? When I think of policing, I also think of other technological means in terms of metal detectors or like wands or scanners or different things of that sort to be able to like check individuals before they leave in and out of certain buildings. You can think of like schools, federal or just like private buildings, different things like that, right? So those are also forms of policing. But then I also think of just like kind of environmental and social policing. So this is more so ones, or at least forms of policing that is not necessarily done by police force themselves, so like cops, but instead is done by like community kind of groups or like neighborhood watch organizations, different things like that. Or even in terms of environmental policing, thinking about just like literally, what is it, the like forest cops or like the nature preserve police and things like that. I can't think of the name specifically off the top of my head, but right. So those are other forms of policing as well that people may not commonly think of, but are, you know, places and things that we do commonly police that is done through the criminal justice system. So yeah, I think it's super important to think about like what exactly is policing when we think about how to construct apps. So on the potential policing affirmatives, there's a lot that I think that will be relevant to the discussion that people could talk about. That will be like super like good debates, I think. The first one that's just general and comes to mind that I think everybody has thought of when thinking about the topic is the very relevant conversation that is happening in the status quo in a lot of different states and local entities, and that's defunding or abolishing the police. Right, so just drawing the question of what is the necessity of police forces? Do we actually need them to be able to keep safety and security in our communities? Are they only there kind of to like harass individuals, right, but not really attempt to be, I guess, what is seen as more of a like bureaucratic leg of law enforcement, right? Normally they're supposed to be the bridge between lawmakers and judges, right, to be able to be an advocate for the community and resolve ills. And instead, a lot of times police officers' first reaction is just to detain someone or to, you know, put handcuffs on them and then attempt to resolve or remedy the issue, or just naturally because of the environment see individuals as a threat and not give them the opportunity to justifiably defend themselves or even speak out to say why in which they should not be arrested or taken to jail or any of those things, right? So I think that defunding or abolishing police is an important conversation that rallies around kind of all those concepts. Banning military weapons. Currently, local and state forces are able to basically buy stockpiles of military grade weaponry from the federal government that is not used in like certain wars or conflicts, things like that. So there's some police forces like in terms of like they can have, for instance, like tanks or different things like that, or even just like military grade vehicles, weapons like grenade launchers and grenades in general, which I don't know why you would need for like your community. But like different types of weapons that they can get access to that are used by like U.S. military, but it's just in excess. So local and state police forces can buy those. So the affirmative can like ban the ability for them to be able to buy those weapons or get access to them. Another affirmative I was thinking of is police training that can kind of like be done in a multitude of different ways. So this can be a question of like training for racial bias, to ensure that all active, current, and future police officers make sure they have some racial bias training. Some type of empathy training can be good as well to be included. This can be courses on non-lethal de-escalation. So this could be literally potentially eliminating the ability for cops to carry weapons. And then they only have to use tactics that are necessary to be able to contain someone if it does get aggressive or something, or have a special police force that is there like in the event that like a shooting occurs and it's more reactionary instead of like precautionary, where like all cops have police officers and just have to use their own personal discretion. So there can be something that can be done with that. So yeah, that can be some good police training affirmatives, or some type of app that eliminates the kind of lethality or the access to the kind of lethal weapons that like police officers have or something. I was thinking of an app about police hiring, which would be a quota question of a certain percentage of the police force for that local area has to be hired from the community itself. That is a very common argument that a lot of the police officers that are working for wherever, whether it be Detroit, Chicago, etc., wherever, that they aren't a part of those communities. So it's hard for them to understand the ills and kind of the issues that plague that particular community, right? So it makes it a little bit tough where for them to like understand they can't really come from a position of like, you know, really getting where it comes from. So that can prevent some of the bias that happens with somebody who like is a Detroit police officer, but after they get off the clock, they got to go to Bloomfield Hills, right? SROs, or school to prison pipeline affirmatives, I think could be important. So SROs being security resource officers. So this is like security officers in your school or in the area. I find it very interesting to this day for some reason why Detroit has their own police force that is for public schools. Obviously, again, that money can be used for other things. But when you think about school to prison pipeline, the way that, you know, like high school students or middle school students are already kind of like criminalized or just like under this realm of always assuming that they're just going to be a threat to society and not giving them an opportunity before they can even get like a high school diploma or be an adult, and they're already being tried as adults, seen as threats, right? So things like SROs promote that logic where it's like, if you like, why do you need police officers or security officers in school, especially considering that a lot of them, most like urban communities, the biggest issue or the biggest kind of front or argument for why you would is because of school shootings. But that rarely kind of happens in our community in terms of just like school shootings where somebody comes to a school and like shoots it up. So it seems like there's not really a necessity in the most disadvantaged areas. So that can be an app that can be read. Eliminating neighborhood surveillance can be one. So this can be like eliminating the city's kind of increase of cameras. A perfect example is just kind of like how downtown is now completely shifted to apparatus where there's a surveillance camera on like every corner, so kind of eliminated the hyper surveillance that's kind of occurring in Detroit. Police body cam affirmatives, which can mandate that all police officers have to wear body cameras, so there's higher accountability. So yeah, those are some affirmatives I think could be like really good for policing. In terms of sentencing, right? So the definition I pretty much got generally was that sentencing is declaring the punishment decided for an offender, right? So this is just some type of, you know, some type of punishment for somebody being convicted or found guilty in a court for a certain crime. And there's a multitude of different sentences that the United States federal government already utilizes in the criminal justice system, one being jailing in prison, right? So obviously you're guilty of certain crimes, you automatically go to jail. Death or execution. So some people in some states, based on the crime and how severe it is, can be sentenced to death in various ways, where there's like lethal injection, firing squad, you know, electric chair, any of those things. So different states have different options. Some don't even have the death penalty. But yeah, so that's one. Parole and probation, house arrest. Right, so you getting convicted but not having to serve time in jail, but instead having to serve it outside in some way, shape, or form. Rehabilitation and counseling, even though it is rarely used, to be honest, it can be an option that courts can utilize for kind of a guilty verdict. So this can be sending you to a rehab center. If you are somebody who is related, like as a drug-related offense, and you were found having like substances in your body, this can also be like a form of counseling for like anger management, retail theft counseling, how to properly use a firearm if it's an issue of like a misfire, anything like that, right? So there's a multitude of different counseling that they can give. Community service is a common one. So this can be like cleaning up a community, engaging with some community organization like a Boys and Girls Club or something like that to get some service hours to show your dedication to the community. Fees, which is like a big thing that only rarely happens in the United States, is that individuals will have to pay heavy sums or fees for crimes that are committed. And then revoking rights, right? So obviously we know for felons, a lot of them have rights that are taken away from them, and it varies by state. Some, obviously, a lot of places you have to check that box to say you're a felon, so that prevents you in terms of qualification for jobs to be able to get certain opportunities. But then obviously the most generic one is your inability to vote after you are convicted of a felony. So yeah, those are things that like pretty much courts can do, or the criminal justice system can utilize if you are found guilty. So some of the apps that I kind of thought about that would be pretty good will be abolish prisons, right? So it can be an argument in terms of why mass incarceration, right? It's obviously correlated to histories of like slavery and all those things. So you can make arguments about like why we should get rid of prisons altogether and shift to a more rehabilitative focus. Abolish the death penalty, so more of a subset of the app. It can be more specific to kind of the morality of the question of should like the law be able to determine or have state sanctioned killings or murders and be justified because of the crime that an individual committed. So that can be an argument that people can read. An app that eliminates court fees. Obviously, for a lot of individuals who get convicted of petty crimes, the reason why some of them have to go back, or at least why they end up going back, is because they can't already afford to like pay for the court fees. Then in the case that a lot of times if you like skip bail, or if you don't pay certain fees, you automatically have to go back to either serve the continued time that you had that was based on you paying the fee, or you just have to serve time because you never paid the fee. So that can be an argument. Eliminating minimum sentencing can be a really good one, I think, because obviously there's a lot of nuance and variance that goes into one, the intent in terms of people committing crimes, but also just the situation and a lot of things involved and a lot of variables that I think that certain crimes obviously should not have a certain like mandatory minimum. So that can be one as well. So the felony rights affirmative, we were just kind of talking about that. That can be an argument, or at least an app where you argue that the federal government should not be able to revoke rights from individuals because of being convicted. I was thinking of a war on drugs affirmative. That's more about decriminalization and legalization to prevent individuals from being like arrested for like drug offenses. So in terms of the, the eliminated 3 strikes and the life affirmative. So I thought this one was pretty good as well. I think that this one is pretty simple. Some states have 3 strike clause where you commit 3 crimes of a certain degree or severity, you auto get a life sentence. So an app that just eliminates that. An affirmative that eliminates life sentences or mandatory life sentences can be an app as well. Solitary confinement, that's like a pretty good argument, I think, that people can make in terms of it being a form of torture, right? Being confined to a space without many like necessities and amenities, obviously is pretty like gruesome. So that can be an argument. Drug treatment affirmatives, I think, can be pretty good. So instead of individuals being convicted for substance abuse or different things like that, or even possession, can instead go through drug treatment classes or some form of rehabilitation that trades off with being penalized or convicted. Police conviction affirmative, I thought would be good. So to talk about how we can kind of reformulate the way in which the federal government deals with a lot of these high profile kind of court, like police cases where the police officer kills an individual and then kind of gets off a lot of times, one, because they'll just bring it down to a lesser crime to where they only serve maybe a few years or something. But also because of it just being within the reins of authority that they have, where obviously there's a world where they have to use lethal force on somebody. There's like a lot of scrutiny in terms of the judge on whether or not they were wrong in the situation, if they adequately used force in the correct way, or if it was excessive, all those type of things. So some type of law that would change the way in which like we look at the way, like, or at least reform the way in which the police kind of get off, or incorporate some new law to make it a little bit tougher. And then lastly, wrongful conviction affirmatives, I think could be good to kind of think about exactly how we can introduce some law to remedy the world where a lot of individuals who are wrongly convicted, when they get out, the only thing they can potentially look forward to is like a settlement that often isn't really a lot to supplement your entire life, or at least like the time that you have been in jail. But even more than that, it's just like the kind of quantitative like aspect or things that they can give you in a process of like you committing a crime or anything like that. A lot of times it's like, what is money when I lost 10, 20 years or so in prison? That's not only time you get back, but just like traumatic experiences that you could have dealt with while you were in jail. A lot of mental like illnesses, like in a variance of things. So, you know, affirmative that's kind of tailored towards remedying, like, or at least having some type of resolve for people who get out, whether it be a job guarantee, a certain settlement guarantee for a certain amount of years served, or any of that. I think it'd be like really good affirmatives to talk about. And then moving on to forensic science, the general kind of definition that I saw that I thought would be useful and applicable is that forensic science is the application of scientific principles and techniques to matters of criminal justice, especially as relating to the collection, examination, and analysis of physical evidence, right? So forensic science essentially is kind of the use of science, both, you know, when it comes to a physical kind of application, when it comes to like biology or like chemistry, but definitely comes into the realm of more like technological needs now as well, which we'll get to in a second. But pretty much any of those kind of techniques that use science to be able to determine whether or not like somebody is guilty, right, or can be utilized in court cases to come to a consensus or a decision, right? So obviously this is like DNA samples, so it can be like hair, nails, bodily fluids, things like this, right, can be like utilized. And this comes into the realm obviously of like bodies post, you know, when they're like dead, right? And then you have to do like autopsy, stuff like that falls into forensic science. Fingerprints, super common one that everybody pretty much knows. And then cyber data, which I don't think would be a kind of a common guess, is that like pretty much anything that's material or like has been utilized for a cyber crime can also be used as evidence to convict somebody when it comes to forensic science. So that is a super important one to kind of like hold on to and remember. So forensic science, I think, I mean, obviously, as you can see from the list, I think it will be kind of an underutilized area of the topic, just because I think that a lot of people are just going to focus a lot on more the policing and the sentencing aspect, but I think forensic science can have some like really good arguments. But I couldn't really draft up like too many, I guess, but some that I thought straight up, which makes sense, is like the DNA courts affirmative, using the Dauber standard. So this is basically something that is used in courts from the defense side of things, where you pretty much can prevent certain pieces of evidence that is seen as not legitimate or illegitimate pieces of evidence, right? DNA or whatever it is, forensic science, that can be dismissed or not utilized to make a verdict or a decision in court. So kind of using or just like revising the Daubert standard to make it to where certain DNA evidence can't be dismissed to get a more accurate depiction of exactly what happened in a crime, or to make sure that nobody is wrongfully convicted, can be like super good. Genealogy affirmative, I think, can also be a persuasive claim, right? So like genealogy kits are those kind of DNA tests that people take. We do like a mouth swab, you said some hair, something like that, like the kind of 23andMe ancestry type stuff where you try to see your background or your lineage, or where your family comes from. A lot of those private companies sell your information to not only just other private companies, but also to the federal government, right? So it can literally be utilized to convict somebody or to figure out a criminal case. So for instance, I mean, because of the kind of inaccurate way that like DNA is utilized for criminal court cases, if it's the case that like you input your DNA trying to see like where you're from, and then unfortunately some DNA that you have matches up at a crime scene, then you could potentially be putting yourself in harm's way just by trying to see like what your background is, right? So it's pretty scary. So like they already have the consent to do so. So that can be like, yeah, that's definitely an app I think would be like really good. DNA backlog affirmative. So I think this one will be relative to just the large number of backlogs that the courts have in general, that they aren't like utilizing to interpret or figure out if somebody was guilty or not. Just like the past few years, Detroit specifically was working on like clearing up backlogs that I think officially did not get cleared up until last year or so, maybe, where there was a lot of cases that were kind of used for instances of like sexual assault or rape, where they just like literally weren't utilized to be able to convict somebody or determine whether or not somebody was guilty or if they had committed that crime. So there was a lot of unresolved cases for individuals that had consented to obviously whatever was necessary for the judge and for forensic scientists to figure out if somebody was assaulted or not, for them to not even get a verdict years later because it was never entered into the system. So some type of affirmative that clears up the backlog of DNA cases can be something that can be super beneficial. And then DNA accuracy. I think that is underplay how much and how inaccurate DNA evidence is utilized when it comes to trying to convict somebody. There's just the different methods are not synonymous throughout all states and localities. Certain areas have particular practices that they follow that they think will be able to have the best outcomes. Some are, you can send a DNA kit to Michigan and have them do a test case and see if they find out if somebody was guilty. And then you can send that same test kit to like somewhere in Louisiana or something, and they can come up with completely different decisions based on whatever process that they follow. So there's not a synonymous kind of process for like using DNA evidence when trying to convict somebody, which makes it scary, but also just in general, DNA being utilized itself as a practice is very inaccurate and oftentimes is not 100%. So I think that some type of affirmative that makes it to where it increases the accuracy, which can, I don't know, just like I said, kind of have a more uniform way in which that the criminal justice system across the country comes to a decision, and they figure out what is the best method and eliminate kind of the more worst methods, but definitely something to incorporate, like having more accuracy and decreasing the wrongful convictions that occur because of the bad practices in terms of forensic science for like DNA. Can be like a really good affirmative. So shifting over to the neg hat a little bit, we kind of want to talk about like some ideals or important subjects that I think would just be like critical on a topic, obviously topicality being one of them. So the wording, there's at least 3 kind of areas that I really wanted to focus on outside of the specific subject areas that we've already kind of mentioned and talked about. So first is definitely the word enact. So when I looked it up, it says that enact is to make a bill or other proposal of law, right? So enact is like a word that hasn't been often utilized in like resolutions over the past couple of years. And I think that it's very important because there's a lot of scholarship, or at least there is a lot of publications that says that enact is only something that's in the power or authority of Congress or the legislative branch, right? So to enact making a bill, right, that is something that is only done through the legislative or executive or something like that, but not something that the courts can do, right? Because the courts interpret the constitutionality of like a law, right, if it's just or not, being able to create or incorporate like new laws and policies, right? So it definitely is a big question that's going to be on T in terms of like general affirmatives that don't isolate or specify that they use the courts, or even affirmatives that do use the courts. People will read T enact against you to be able to question or argue if the courts have the ability to be able to enact something, right? So that is super important to kind of think about. Right, then obviously substantial, it was in last year's topic, but it's also in this topic. This is a word that is like commonly used, but I think that it's important that y'all begin to think about the debate of qualitative versus quantitative discussions of substantial, right? The definition that I got says of considerable importance, size, or worth. And that already kind of gets into it, because it's a question of just like what is a substantial, or at least what kind of affirmative do you think is of substantial importance, and which one do you think is not? Right, so which ones are more valuable and has worth, and which ones don't, right? So I think that looking at it in a quantitative sense, like, do we have to spend a certain amount of money? Does it have to be in like all areas, or like is it a question of like bodies that are affected that will resolve the kind of quantitative questions? But then on the other side of the hat, when it looks at quantity, right, are we able to just justify if the effect of the plan is significant, then that means that it's okay if it only is isolating one particular individual or a group, right? So I definitely think it's super important to start to think about the question of how we look at substantial and what exactly is substantial criminal justice reform. So yeah, that's definitely something I think that should be important to think about. And then lastly, I wanted to isolate kind of the phrase that is in the resolution in the United States that specifies the criminal justice reform that occurs has to affect, right, the United States in terms of geographically, right? So this allows you to kind of talk about affirmatives about Guantanamo Bay or military bases where they may have like I don't know, prisoners of war or different things like that are not here stationed in the United States. Anything of that nature would not be topical because it is not within the kind of legal boundaries, like I said, geographically of the United States. So even affirmatives, yeah, that you would think of like prisoners of war, different things like that, technically wouldn't be T, but obviously could be read as a critical affirmative, but in a policy kind of sense, you will only be able to talk about like how we can remedy it here and not the replication that kind of occurs internationally through our military industrial complex, through our spread of democracy or hegemony or other means. So now shifting over to counterplans, some core counterplans that I thought was going to be like good to kind of talk about and discuss on this topic. I think states and like state courts is just going to be a very like straightforward but very common and core argument for the negative to read against a lot of these affirmatives to have ground because it utilizes the federal government. However, a lot of the criminal court cases that are taken up that are handled on a daily, weekly, monthly, and yearly basis are almost like predominantly handled in the local and state levels, right? So it's the question of who has authority and is there actually genuine federal overreach that occurs, right? Because obviously while the federal government is the one that makes laws and then relegates the power to states to be able to figure out how they best want to enact that law or policy in their particular kind of areas. You know, it is important to think about how the federal government has a plan. That perfect example, you know, Second Amendment gives you the right to bear arms, but each state has their own gun laws, right? Same thing for, you know, a variance of other things. So it's super important to kind of think about that. Courts counterplans, again, like I was saying, is a little bit, obviously it's different. State courts is a question of just like state courts doing it. The courts counterplan is saying instead of, right, the legislative or executive branch, we should have the courts do it. I think that this is going to also be like a really good core argument as well in terms of questioning the constitutionality of like certain things is a very central issue when it comes to criminal justice reform, right? If it's an act that is lawful or an unlawful, right? So courts are going to be super important. I thought grassroots counterplans could be something that'd be really good, the trade-off between kind of legal reform that occurs through the criminal justice system that could potentially perpetuate some of the same ills, as versus the grassroots counterplans that has more of a bottom-up approach in terms of having individuals who are most affected by laws and legislation or by like convictions and all those things be at the forefront of the movements for change for criminal justice, because obviously they probably would have the best interest of most individuals who are disadvantaged by the criminal justice system, as well as people who are currently serving time in it as well. So advocates for grassroots movements and different coalitions and organizations could be like very useful here in this front. And then obviously EXO counterplan, so executive order counterplan, or having the executive immediately sign it into law, right? So that it becomes a new policy. I think it'd be like a strong, like good argument that the negative could read as well in terms of like negative ground and competitiveness. So yeah. All right, switching over to disadvantages. So obviously elections is going to be like a super core argument. Like it's just, it makes sense. Like people are going to make the argument the election is in November. So it's going to be like a hotbed conversation for the next couple of months, or at least the first half of the season. And then kind of jumping down to the bottom a little bit real quick, hopefully, and that's a big hope, is that we will have agenda disadvantages, right? Which will just be arguments about a particular policy that is super controversial, or is you know, a significant issue or something, or a policy we need to pass. And that the plan being a significant issue, criminal justice reform, could potentially trade off with the focus of a particular you know, agenda item, which could be like healthcare. It could be some type of like free trade agreement or something like that, right? That can just be some type of a top docket issue that Congress and executive are like working on that needs a lot of kind of political capital to be able to like push through. So agenda dispatch can be a good thing, but it's just a question of, you know, if one, who wins, and two, what they will push post-election. Spending disadvantage, I think, is super important as well. A lot of these asks would definitely be a heavy expenditure, right? Criminal justice reform costs billions of dollars, right? So if you think about the question of releasing, or at least, sorry, if you're thinking about like body cams, or, you know, new rehabilitation centers and all those things, it's a question of like, where do we get the funds? Probably means that we will have to deficit spend to be able to immediately emerge these programs or these kind of reinvigorated ways in which we deal with criminal justice reform. So the spending this act can be like a really good argument. The Hollow Hope DA, which can be read as a critique as well, it's just an argument saying that like kind of continuation of investment in the state is bad, because it just leads to kind of a continuation or a cycle of like that violence where when we rely on the state to be able to remedy or reform things, it just kind of regurgitates itself in a different shape that we aren't able to figure out until it just gets so severe that we can't help but acknowledge it. And then after that, we will proceed to kind of do the same thing, call for reform, then a new issue arises, etc. Right? And it just becomes a continuous cycle. So Hollow Hope DA can be a good argument. I kind of alluded where I mentioned it previously already for the state's counterplan. Obviously, federalism being the net benefit is going to be a very common argument as well, right? The kind of collapse of authority between the state and federal governments is going to be an important conversation or discussion. So yeah, that's going to be super big. Court clog DA for a lot of court affirmatives. That's kind of one of the bigger issues. One that I'll isolate in forensic science, right, is that there is just an extreme heavy backlog of not being able to kind of keep up with the pace in which these cases are happening, right? So a new affirmative that's dealt with through the courts can definitely have some effect on the kind of already increased, the already heavy workload that lawyers, defense attorneys, like prosecutors, judges have, and can exacerbate it even more, right? And then there's kind of the grassroots and protest trade-off disadvantage that you can read in tandem with the grassroots counterplan, which is basically an argument saying that currently individuals are protesting now and it's kind of galvanizing support and getting movements. But when we shift away from kind of self-sufficiency or where we rely on just like communal organizations to be able to resolve a lot of these things, then when we invest in legal reform, then that will kind of, again, kind of reinvert the era. So kind of similar to Hollow Hope, but more so in the question of like the story of the net benefits of the counterplan, be it that we need an alternative to the state instead of just like the problem, instead of problematizing it, right? It's just saying that we should prioritize the focus on protests and on grassroots movements. Yeah. And then lastly, obviously, we'll talk about like critiques a little bit. So I definitely think, obviously, one of the biggest debates and conversations that is going to occur if you're reading a policy affirmative is that the abolition critique pretty much applies and links to like everything that has to do with reforming the criminal justice system. Reform and abolition is just going to be like a central kind of debate. Even if people aren't one-off reading abolition, they can still incorporate and read them. It's just like case turns. So that's just a common argument you just have to be ready for, is that people are going to say instead of reforming the system, we should abolish it, or we should have some type of ethic or logic that we endorse that kind of gets us away from the, the idea that we actually need the state to be able to like fix these things, right? So like capitalism, neoliberalism, semio-cap, stuff like that is obviously going to also be kind of important on this topic. So if you are reforming the criminal justice system, it probably means that there's going to be some portion of it that still exists post-plan, if that is true, because of the way that it functions, where it's motivated by like penalty and profit instead of kind of resolving ills for particular people who are disadvantaged. Or people who are convicted, right? That we only really care about the continuation of like the accumulation of capital or the promotion of the market, like private prisons, like all those type of things. And it will just like continue to manifest if we just like have the criminal justice system altogether. So like capitalism can be an arc. Biopower critique is a really good argument, right? So just literally just the United States or any government's kind of a body or power or authority over bodies. Right, so this goes kind of like heavily into talking more about the way in which like the criminal justice system, or the like how the prison like pipeline kind of functions a little bit more, and how like individual agency works in relation to the state. It's going to be like super good arguments, I think. Afro-pessimism or other Afrocentric scholarship, I think, will be really good. I think Afro-pessimism in general, though, is just like a really good response to a lot of these AFs. So I think a lot of the literature that's already kind of written in that vein will like be super, super good to be able to argue like why we should not probably invest, not even in just like criminal justice system, but the United States federal government writ large, and just the way in which society props up to kind of like demarcate certain bodies inevitably is just like inferior or not being able to access like autonomy or civility or humanity and all those things, right? And then necropolitics, which is pretty much prescribing certain value to certain bodies in terms of determining like how certain people die, how they live, right? All those type of things, right? So necropolitics also can be kind of a, I think, a really, really good argument as well on the topic. It definitely makes a lot of sense, kind of again in tandem a little bit with like the biopower stuff in terms of the relation of like power over bodies that are kind of forwarded by the federal government. But I think that, yeah, those are going to be some of the core general areas. And obviously, I've isolated a lot of particular kind of concepts and ideals in terms of how I have looked at the topic. I will definitely say that I want to motivate everyone to think beyond the scope of what I've already introduced, but just kind of use this as a foundation or a palette to be able to unearth or think about things that you think will be interesting to kind of talk about on the topic. And then even if you want to further invest in it as well, that's fine. But I definitely don't want you to shortstop your investment in the topic, just short of the kind of item list that I already have. So hopefully this was kind of insightful. Hopefully it gave you like a really good kind of intro to the topic. I'm very forward to looking into like these debates that we're gonna, have over the course of this week, as well as the rest of the season. Even though it's a virtual kind of aspect to it, I think that there's gonna be some like very enriching conversations that I think everybody's gonna be able to enjoy. So obviously, if y'all have any questions, my email is browndarcell@gmail.com. Darcell is spelled D-A-R-C-E-L-L. There's no cap spaces, underscores, any of that thing. It's just my last and first name at Gmail. And I will be like peering into all y'all's lectures anyway. So if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.